I now want to bring in Charles Benson, anchor here at WTMJ Milwaukee, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thanks to all of you for being here. Charles, thank you for having us in your beautiful studio and newsroom. We appreciate it. Let me start with you. Set the stakes for tomorrow night. What are voters here in Milwaukee and across the state going to be watching for? What are you going to be watching for?
Well, I think people in Wisconsin probably are more focused on who's going to be, or I should say, how well Jordan Love is doing as the Packers quarterback. And when I found out Stephen Hayes was going to be here, I thought that's what we were.
That was what we were going to talk about. That's the next segment.
Yes.
Okay.
But since there is this big debate in our backyard, people would ask me, do you think the former president will be here? And I said, I think that's a trick question, because I was thinking that maybe he would be here, but maybe not on the stage. So he's still going to have a presence. He's still very popular among the Republican Party in Wisconsin. But I do think this is a chance that a lot of Republican voters are going to say, if not Donald Trump, who? And so they're going to see those other 8 candidates. And how does he compare, knowing how well they know the former president and his message? So that's where I think Republican voters are going to lean in tonight and say, who are these guys? And the one-woman candidate, female, and whether or not they can be the next president or the one that they will want to back.
Stephen, what do you make of that? And you know, Dasha talked about the fact that this is a chance for a breakthrough moment, a viral moment. You almost need a viral moment at this point, because you're seeing how high up former President Trump is in the polls. I mean, what do you think these candidates need to do to break through to voters?
Well, I mean, the very first thing they need to do is provide some contrast to Donald Trump. Thus far, what's been the most remarkable thing about the Republican primary is most of them are running to win that 40% of people who are hardcore Trump supporters already. Ron DeSantis has built his campaign around trying to peel away some of those voters rather than focus on the 50+% of Republican voters who are gettable. Some of them like Donald Trump. Some of them thought he was a good president. Some of them can't stand Donald Trump. There are a lot of voters there. Our NBC poll of likely caucus goers in Iowa, 41% want Donald Trump to remain the head of the Republican Party. 57%, if you take the other 2 categories, are potentially gettable. And you have campaigns, other than Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, Will Hurd, who won't be on the stage, that are built around going after the 41%. My big question tonight is, who drives the contrast? We know Chris Christie's going to do it. We know Asa Hutchinson's going to do it. Does anybody else take a step away and say, I'm taking on Donald Trump?
What do you make of the fact that we are seeing Ron DeSantis inch closer to trying to make that sharp contrast? Over the weekend, he referred to Mr. Trump's supporters, he appeared to, as being listless, kind of doubled down on those comments. What do you make of the fact that he seems to be sharpening his tone? Is that a sign we could see him sharpen his tone at the debate?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, he made the comments that you said, and then his campaign went on and blamed it on the left-wing media for misinterpreting what he said. They didn't misinterpret what he said. They just reported what he said, and what he said was, particularly Donald Trump's supporters in Congress were these listless vessels and sort of following a cult leader. They weren't conservative. Now, if Ron DeSantis decides to make the argument that Donald Trump wasn't conservative in the same way that Ron DeSantis is conservative, pointing to people like Chip Roy and others in Congress who have endorsed Ron DeSantis, then you might start to see some of that contrast. But unless and until he does that, and unless and until he points that out, he shouldn't leave it to us to interpret what he's doing or to say, oh, I think that might have been a shot at Donald Trump. He needs to say it.
Charles.
I know it's a national audience, but in Wisconsin, if you look at one poll back in June, which now seems like ancient history on Marquette, when Republican voters were asked between Trump and DeSantis, DeSantis moves well ahead of the former president in that one poll. So I think a lot of voters, because they've heard about DeSantis, he's been on the ground here a couple of times in Wisconsin, they're going to see how does he handle the stage with all these other contenders. I also wonder about Mike Pence, who has had trouble sort of grasping or getting some traction. He's a guy who spent a lot of time in Wisconsin for the former president. So I'm curious to see if he has a breakthrough moment as well, knowing that Wisconsin voters know him pretty well.
What do you think Wisconsin voters want to see from Ron DeSantis? Do you think they want to see him get tougher? As you point out, former President Trump's still pretty popular in this state. Or do you think they want him to focus on his policies?
So that's what I keep wondering. I still think policy is the most important at the end of the day. Look, when I talk to Republicans, they do not believe or are buying in Bidenomics. We saw the president here last week, the vice president here. They're selling their economic policy, and Republicans are not buying it. They don't see the benefits of that. So if DeSantis is going to try to talk about a governor who's done something in a state, I think that might be his talking points. And keep in mind, and Stephen will know this, when you look at Republican history in Wisconsin, sort of the breakthrough names, Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, right? Principled conservatives. So does he try to appeal to those folks who voted for those two guys, or does he need to have a breakout moment?
And we're going to hear from Scott Walker a little bit later on in the hour. Pick up on that point. And also, I think the question of former Vice President Mike Pence is a fascinating one. I was talking to caucus goers in Iowa who said, boy, he showed so much strength on January 6th, obviously the ones who don't support former President Trump, and yet I'm still not ready to support him. I've been talking to the Pence campaign, and they say the former vice president is going to view this as a chance to reintroduce himself to voters. How fascinating. He's the former vice president.
Yeah, he's probably come closest to this balance. You know, on the one hand, you have Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson and others who are they're going to take every opportunity to pound Trump. On the other hand, you have the group that's mostly echoing and amplifying Donald Trump's arguments. Mike Pence has not done that. He's taken this opening that January 6th and his actions on January 6th has given him and made an argument about it. Like, he didn't win the election. I had to do what I had to do. Will he find a way to make an appeal to those conservatives, to the Paul Ryan conservatives, to Scott Walker conservatives? The risk is, of course, Trump and others will say, oh, this is Mike Pence, the establishment, which is, you know, a toxic thing to be called in today's Republican Party. But I think if you stick to policy arguments, there's a lot of support for those the lower taxes, the bold reforms that Scott Walker introduced in Wisconsin.
Charles, final point to you. Is there any scenario where you see the decision to skip this first debate backfiring against former President Trump in this state or in any other state across the country?
So to me, it will be something that former Governor Scott Walker would say, because he was on the debate stage with Donald Trump. He knows him as a prize fighter, right? A guy who can land the knockout punch. But tonight, does something happen in a key moment, in a key exchange, that he gets the knockout and isn't there to defend it? I think that will be the next morning regret. The question is it in any one of these other 8 candidates to pull that off?
Great question. We'll leave it there. Fantastic conversation. Thank you both. Great to see you. Thank you again for hosting us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.